On behalf of the Observer Research Foundation, I welcome you all to this book discussion that we are having online today. We will be discussing a book, The Art of Political Control in China. And we have with us the author, Dr. Daniel Mattingly from Yale. And we've also have a very special panel to discuss this book. We have Professor Varaprasad Dola from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Javin Jacob from Shiv Nadar University, Antara Ghoshal Singh from the Center for Social and Economic Progress. A warm welcome to all of you. The book Art of Political Control in China deals with the very intricate relationship that the state and the people have in modern China. So you have the volume, the book basically gives the reader a better understanding of how China has, the Chinese authoritarian system kind of controls protests, but beyond the very coercive methods, and how it is then able to kind of implement its very ambitious programs like the urbanization schemes that China has launched, which have, of course, dislocated millions of people, and also the extremely intrusive population control initiatives like the one-child policy. Now, before we start this discussion, we have our viewers who kind of joined in large numbers. So I suggest that they kind of send in their questions through the Q&A box that they see on their screens. So without further ado, I call upon Dr. Mattingly to tell us what his book is all about. Over to you, sir.
Great, thank you so much, Kalpit, for inviting me here and for organizing this and to the whole Observer Research Foundation team. It's a real honor telling people before that this is the first time I've ever presented anywhere in South Asia, and so I'm very excited and honored, especially this incredible panel of Professors Dole, Kevin, and Tara, whose work I all admire, to have. The art of political control is, as Kalpit suggested, it's about trying to understand the state, the Chinese state controls society. And I'll give you the point right away, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it. The point political control, AI-enabled surveillance cameras, or the social credit system that is the key to understanding how the state controls society in China, but rather it's the ways in which the Chinese state and to some degree all states use society to control it. So before talking about the book, I kind of want to go back in time a little bit, 15 years ago, thinking about my own motivation for writing this book. So this is around the year 2005, and with some friends, I took a cruise from the city of Chongqing to the city of Wuhan, down the Yangtze River, which at that time was just starting to be the Three Gorges Dam had just been completed, and the river was just essentially starting to fill up. And as we went down this kind of amazing 2-day cruise, this beautiful 2-day cruise down the river, saw this pretty remarkable thing where every town, every village, every small city, of course, along the Yangtze, above the Three Gorges Dam, was empty. At that time, they were all ghost towns because the dam had been completed, the reservoir was starting to fill up, and with this really remarkable geoengineering project, the largest dam in the world, and in doing so, the Chinese government had to displace 1.3 million people. Now, I think we can debate the ecological merits or demerits of the dam, the ways in which it, is an engineering marvel, arguably an environmental disaster. But the remarkable thing, seeing these ghost towns as I traveled down the river along with hundreds of thousands of other people that year, was the way in which the state was able to move, in this case, over 1 million people for this one project, off their land, without really meeting that much blowback. And when you think about the way that modern China has developed, it's quite extraordinary. You have to think, you think about this marvel like the Three Gorges Dam, which displaced 1.3 million people. Developments across China has also displaced over 100 million people over the last 20 years. At least 100 million people have been displaced from their land to make way for urbanization, other engineering infrastructure projects, whether it's the Three Gorges Dam or highways or new development zones. So you have to imagine 100 Three Gorges dams spread across China, and partly that's the story of development, the story of wealth creation, the story of lifting people out of poverty is also the story of some people who have been relative losers who have had to do things like move off their lands. And it's clear that coercion itself, that violence isn't enough. The state wasn't using necessarily hard tools of coercion. Sometimes they were, but mostly the state wasn't using hard tools of coercion to move people off their land for projects like the Three Gorges Dam. Nor did it seem like pure economic benefits were necessarily enough. You think about the attachment that people have to their home, the attachment that people have to land that maybe has been in their family for 5, 10, sometimes 15 generations. The puzzle that struck me then 15 years ago, before I'd even gone to graduate school, as I was just fresh college graduate at that time, how did this state do that? And that's the central puzzle that I'm interested in with my book. Is how does the state control society? How does the state control society in ways that are not cool? How does it get people to, Seattle and the Chinese state in particular, get people to comply with it? So interest in this book is political control, which I define as the ability to maintain order, collect revenue, enforce laws, and implement policies. So the question here is, what explains the extraordinary capacity, I think, of the Chinese state to implement policy and get things done, whether it's moving 100 million people off their land, often for less than the land is worth, or implementing the one-child policy, which probably reduced births in China by tens of millions, or whether it's urbanization programs that have moved people off the land, the ability of the state to control protest, or on the darker side, what we see today in the western province of Xinjiang, where the Chinese state has implemented a very kind of dark and quite coercive side of political control. And so I think if and also the coronavirus response too. I think you think today about the extraordinary, in some ways, success of the Chinese state in controlling the coronavirus, certainly relative to the United States, where the coronavirus ran rampant. It's the contrast is quite striking. So what I argue in the book is, as I suggested at the outset, it's not necessarily these digital tools that get a lot of attention in the media, things like facial recognition software. Not that these tools aren't important, but whether it's facial recognition software, which at least in theory can be used to track people in real time. There are problems with facial recognition software, being able to see people when they're not at perfect angles, or when it's dusk, or when it's dusty. Using artificial intelligence to predict behavior, or things like social credit scores. At least in the Western media in the United States, there's been a lot of misreporting on what social credit scores are. They're not quite the dystopian number of that kind of reports people's political loyalty, is how it kind of gets reported in the United States sometimes. That's not really what the social credit system is. Rather, what's happening in China is in this, I argue, the key to the success of the Chinese state implementing policy are more analog tools, not these digital tools of political control, but rather analog tools. Particularly things like, and I talk in my book about 3 tools. Infiltration, the use of creating social organizations to infiltrate and monitor society, cultivating and subverting social organizations that at least have the appearance of independence from the state, but are actually controlled quite tightly by the Chinese Communist Party, and co-optation of elites are the 3 kind of main tools that I argue of. You could think of the softer tools of political control alongside more coercive tools that the state has at its disposal. And it's the ability of the party state to use these strong social organizations to monitor control society that really explains its success. So the state cultivates and subverts state-friendly social groups, co-ops influential elites outside of the state, and infiltrates society through parastate organizations. So this triple strategy of cultivation, co-optation, and infiltration is really at the core, I argue, of what the state does. So let me talk for just a second, in the 3 or 4 minutes that I have left in my 10 minutes, about each of these strategies in turn and give you a kind of a brief, sketch out a really brief example of each of these in 1 minute each. So the first is cultivating state-friendly groups. So when I did field research, the book itself draws on qualitative field research that I did in villages across China using kind of controlled comparative case studies, and also quantitative data, some national surveys that others conducted, as well as quantitative data that I collected. So one strategy that the CCP uses to control society is the strategy of cultivating state-friendly groups. So in rural China, which was really the focus of the book, this could mean things like cultivating and subverting what you could think of as either social organizations, solidarity groups, or civil society organizations. So it could be social organizations like lineage associations. These are kinship groups, which often sometimes are kind of village-sized social groups, extended clans, or more sort of classic civil society groups like music troops. These social groups are often useful for the state, even though they seem to exist outside of the state, even though you might think that they could be used to challenge the state. Instead, they are actually quite useful for the state for making society more legible. In other words, making it easier for people, for local officials to count and understand where people are and understand people's political attitudes and beliefs. And it can also be, these organizations are also useful for collecting information, and finally for promoting values of compliance and loyalty and deference to elites that are quite useful to the local state. So outside of mainland China is this strategy that the Communist Party uses in other places. So for example, outside of mainland China and Hong Kong, Special Administrative Region of Hong Kong, it's part of Greater China, but when the protests last in 2019 that rocked Hong Kong, one important way that the state tried to create a counter mobilization against these democracy protests were using native place associations like Fujianese, the province of Fujian, Fujianese native place associations, which were essential for organizing counter protests against the pro-democracy protesters. Co-optation is the second major strategy that I talk about. So in rural China, you could think, for example, the leaders of lineage groups and religious groups or civil society groups like local traditional dance troupes are quite useful for the state and or for implementing policies like the one-child policy or convincing people to leave their land for land requisitions, because these people have significant moral authority and can be used to help persuade people to comply with the state. So co-opting these elites is a quite useful strategy. The third strategy, and I'm running out of time here, so I need to be quick here, is a strategy of infiltration. This is something that you see across China and Greater China, and something that the CCP also does outside of China, which is to create organizations, whether it's neighborhood associations in urban China. These neighborhood committees are essential for implementing policy like the one-child policy. They are also essential for doing things like monitoring people during the coronavirus outbreak, taking people's temperature, ensuring that people who are sick didn't leave their residences. These are very local organizations, and because they're so deeply embedded in and intertwined with society, they're very useful for the state for extracting information, for monitoring society, and also for being the kind of nerve tips, as my colleague Ben Reed has called them, the nerve tips of the state in local society. Outside of China, you also have organizations like the United Front, which can be used to organize, groups within China and outside of China to do things like mobilize in favor of state policies. So I've run out of time. So let me just briefly summarize. So what explains the extraordinary capacity of the Chinese state? If we go back to this opening idea of traveling down the Yangtze River in 2005 and seeing these ghost cities, these completely empty cities that were about to be flooded by the Yangtze, and kind of marveling at the ability of the state to get over 1 million people to move off their land for this project. What explains the extraordinary ability of the Chinese state to implement policy? And my argument in the book is it's not digital tools of control. It's actually using organizations you could think of as, in a very broad sense, civil society organizations that other people have argued are used to hold the state accountable. These are actually also very useful for the state to control this, to control society. So in the end, how does the Chinese state control society? Use a society to control itself. Well, thanks so much again to Kalpin. I really look forward to Professors Dola, Jacob, and Antara, and to the audience questions. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation on the book. I call upon Dr. Dola from JNU, and Dr. Dola has written extensively on China's technological progress and its domestic politics. So over to you, sir, for your comments and your perspectives on the book.
Thank you, Mr. Mankika, for this invitation to shed some of my reflections on the book. Right at the outset, I would like to congratulate Dr. Daniel Mattingly for putting together this beautiful, a book that actually in some ways pushes the envelope by challenging the conventional wisdom. And also it's good to be with the other book discussants, Dr. Jabin Jacob and Ms. Antara Singh, who are going to throw some light on the book. In the last few decades, the global community has been mesmerized by the rapid economic growth in China, coupled with its concomitant rise in global politics. In the process, the global community has been in some ways blind to dig deep into the more important issues of political control in domestic context. And I'm glad that Dr. Mattingly chose the theme of political control in China and articulated with considerable finesse and erudition, and thus added to the existing body of literature pioneered by several sinologists in the last few decades, and of course, even in the last couple of centuries. The title, The Art of Political Control in China, reminded me of the art of war. I think that's the first thought that came to my mind when I saw the book. But the difference, though, is that the art of war is a Chinese perspective, or a native Chinese perspective of the various facets of war. But what Dr. Daniel Mattingly brings to us is about the art of political control in the contemporary period. I think this distinction in some ways it gives us an interesting clue in the trajectory in which the Chinese society, and particularly polity, has been unfolding. And interestingly, the central theme of the book, in many ways, tries to challenge the conventional wisdom that a robust civil society strengthens political responsiveness. But the core finding of the book is the presence of civil society groups helps officials in rural China to tamp down on protest, requisition land, and enforce mandatory birth quotas, as very interestingly Dr. Daniel Mattingly put together. What I shall do in the next few minutes is basically to limit my comments to what I consider to be the 6 core themes delineated in the book. The first is conceptualizing civil society. In fact, there has been a lot of debate on what constitutes, what is the nature of civil society. And in fact, the book outlines by looking at some of the important scholars who have done amazing work. For instance, Hegel, and again, Robert Putnam, Mary Gallagher, and Samuel Huntington. In fact, the way in which all these scholars gave us an interesting a framework to understand what civil society is all about. And Dr. Mattingly examines by locating the study within this broad scholarship on civil society, and especially focusing on the coercive, not only the coercive, capacity of the state and how it actually tries to shape the civil society, and how the civil society in turn tries to shape the state, because there is always this contestation between these two processes. In fact, he looks at this, contestation in three important realms in terms of, requisitioning land from the farmers, family planning, and protests, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that I would have actually liked within this study is more discussion on Habermasian concept of civil society, and that I found some kind of a discussion on the way in which Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, approached civil society as a very autonomous entity. In fact, that would have actually added an interesting dimension. So I think it is in this context certain questions that need to be asked. One of which is, can a civil society be strong if it is not autonomous? And what are the indicators of a robust civil society, in shaping the state? Of course, there's been an interesting discussion on strong and weak versions of civil society. Of course, the conventional wisdom is that strong civil societies actually shape the state. But Dr. Mattingly actually makes an interesting departure from this and goes to articulate that, sometimes weaker civil societies can also, really shape the state and its policies. And but of course, in trying to look at the nature of civil society, what comes to my mind is Froelic's interesting characterization of civil society in China. In fact, he says civil society is a state-led and state-controlled civil society. And another interesting, I think, reflection that merits some discussion is about the debate that we have within Asia about civil society versus political society, especially in India, whereby the kind of nature of civil society that exists within some of the Asian countries, including India, is not really civil society, but it's a political society, as some of the scholars recently tried to articulate. And the second theme is about theorizing political control. Very interestingly, Dr. Mattingly, conceptualizes or particularly theorizes political control. In fact, he underscores the importance of theorizing non-violent forms of political repression and control. In fact, much of the literature is on the coercive methods of political control, but he actually moves away from that. And in trying to theorize, he also juxtaposes these theoretical frameworks within the practical narrative. In fact, he mentions how Xi Jinping used some of these non-coercive measures in changing the dynamics in Shanxi, in a village in Liangjiahe. So therefore, I think the issue is that how political compliance, is achieved without resorting to formal institutions of coercion. I think that's a very important dimension that Dr. Mattingly brought to us. And he also posits that Chinese leaders exert informal control through CCP and various institutions using three main strategies: cultivating civil society, co-opting local elites, and infiltrating institutions. I think this seems to be a very interesting dimension. And of course, in trying to looking at this one, Dr. Mattingly brought very interesting examples both from the US and various other countries. In fact, he also critiques Dr. Billy Graham's, contribution to, or critique of civil rights movements within China. But I think at the same time, we also must bring in Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who read the same Bible, but actually came up with a very interesting, and a diametrically opposite a view of trying to, looking at political control. And the third is about the comparative element. Dr. Mattingly, again, beautifully, brought in a number of comparative, dimensions to really understand the finer details of political control, both from India, US, Scotland, Venezuela, Hungary, and Russia. A number of countries and their examples and their trajectories have been brought into looking at the nature of political control in various contexts within China. In fact, he also mentioned Vladimir Putin's interesting co-option of the church within Russia. And the fourth dimension that I found quite interesting is the historical trajectories that he factored into the understanding of political control, both from imperial China and also Confucianism and Buddhism, various religious discourses, and also interestingly from Mughal India, how Akbar, for instance, effectively used some of the local zamindars and local elites in order to ensure political control. And again, US and even Scotland, some of these interesting facets highlighted the way political control is actually structured in various countries, and how the Chinese political control differs from theirs, or in many ways is quite similar to them. The fifth important theme that I found interesting is the number of case studies. In fact, and if you look at the book, it is replete with several case studies from villages. You can see the number of villages that Dr. Mattingly visited, whether it is Wukan, Yang, Xiaokong, Longqing, then Meilong, Wuxia, Kaichia, and several others. And then all of these actually give you a kind of a perspective from below, how the political control is exercised from below. And the sixth theme that is quite interesting that I found in the book is about implications. Political control in China, as Dr. Mattingly alludes to, is a well-calibrated social engineering framework aimed at, as I would see, economic development, and thus consolidate its comprehensive national power. Chinese leaders, of course, and their attempt to globalize the Chinese model of political control in rural areas will have major ramifications for China and the liberal order in Asia and the rest of the world. Umbrella movement, for instance, in Hong Kong, saw the way in which political control can be exercised, and legislating the national security law in some ways is an attempt to do that. And leaders in democratic countries, including India, seem to replicate the Chinese model of controlling civil society using both the coercive and also non-coercive tools. And in the final few words, I would like to throw some light on three perspectives. One, how can poor and the weak ensure that their governments respond to their needs? I think one of the things is, if we look at what emerges from the discussion, is that the discussion seems to confine itself to the economic, social, and the immediate needs. But the question is, what about the political needs? What about the political ideas and processes at the national level? How the Chinese are grappling with the political ideas of democracy at the national level. The second one, interestingly, the book actually begins with Chiang Mai's painful story of how she actually grappled with this. Where are power kongs who are, committed to, very, interesting ideals of transparency, of equality and dignity. And I would say, may the tribe increase and succeed in genuine social and political transformation in China. And third, juxtaposing political control in rural China with urban China would probably, with some case studies, would have provided some interesting clues into the convergence and divergences between the two. Perhaps this can be Dr. Mattingly's next book, wherein he could probably juxtapose political control in rural China with that of the political control in urban China. There I shall, end my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dola. In fact, in the last few years, we've seen this whole consolidation of President Xi Jinping's personal authority, within the Communist Party. And this kind of new authoritarianism is being justified under the necessity to kind of rejuvenate China. In fact, Professor Jebin Jacob has recently published this book, and we had him on our ORF platform. His book was about the implications of Xi Jinping's domestic policies. Over to you, Professor Jacob, for your perspectives.
Thank you, Kalpit, and thank you to the ORF for giving me an opportunity to read this book faster than I would normally have. There's nothing like a book discussion or a book review to get one's, focus clear on the latest in the field. So actually, let me sort of take off from where Professor Varaprasad left off. Professor Vara is also my teacher from JNU. And where he ends is where I'd like to sort of take off, because he talks about the comparison of political control in rural areas and political control in urban China. But my interest is as in the comparison between India and China. And really, the book speaks to a lot of interesting parallels with India. And my hope is that scholars of India will learn a great deal from the Chinese case using their own perspectives, just as I hope scholars of China might learn from the India story. And that's the lens that I'm using to look at this book. Now, themes such as corruption, economic development imperatives, third worldism, for example, all of these have often been seen as points of convergence for India and China comparisons. But it has seldom been consider just how similar India and China might actually be in their political systems, or at least in the actual end results, even if the forms differ so obviously. But the similarity is actually nothing new. I think many of these similarities were on view practically from the first decades of their independent post-colonial existence. But because political scientists in the two countries seldom consider the other country seriously or worthy of study, the focus has always been westwards or eastwards as far as China is concerned. These similarities have long been ignored. But there have been exceptions. About a decade ago, there was a comparative work by an edited volume by Richard Baum, Marong, and Manoranjan Mohanty on grassroots democracy. In fact, the final chapter of this particular book has Manoranjan Mohanty and Mark Selden talking about power and resistance in the Indian and the Chinese countryside. So, there have been forerunners of this work before, but it has never been pushed much, this comparative aspect. So what this book on political control actually does is remind us of the similarity and therefore the need for comparison and further studies. The BJP and the Communist Party of China are the two largest political parties in the world, and I've said it many times before that they are more alike than different. Some issues of administration, expansion, outlook, worldviews are bound to be similar, just as issues of administration and control are going to be similar for two countries with 1 billion people. And specifically, as Dr. Mattingly notes, at one point he points out a comparison between Weimar Republic of Germany and the China of today. But I'd say that the comparison with India of today is much more appropriate, perhaps fits the bill in terms of several points of comparison. And I would say that just as Indian political scientists should be paying more attention to work such as these, as Dr. Mattingly's, on China's political system, China scholars should also be studying Indian political systems much more closely to draw perhaps finer lessons, about the structures of operation, the constraints and the opportunities available to the CCP in China. I mean, they would do well to look at the works of other scholars, and Dr. Mattingly does reference the work of Pradeep Chibber, but also other Indian political scientists like Suhash Palshikar, Christoph Jaffalo, and even Tariq Tachul's own book in this particular series. I mean, there's a reference to caste and kin in Mughal India, as Professor Varaprasad just pointed out. But you don't really need to go that far back in history. Much of these conditions are still operational in India today. So, the challenge I have I put to younger scholars, especially Indian scholars watching this discussion today, is to actually use your own perspectives. I mean, you're already well aware of the Indian case. Now to use that perspective to study the Chinese case and to sort of draw your own inferences. So to get to the interesting parts of this book, yes, the autocratic side of civil society. I think this is seldom discussed or understood. The fact that civil society can actually strengthen autocratic power, or the power of autocrats or autocratic parties to hold on to authority. A strong civil society can weaken democracy. I think this is a point that needs to be underlined, that it's not always so black and white as to say that civil society supports democracy. But like Professor Varaprasad pointed out, perhaps a greater discussion of what exactly is implied by civil society also, could have been useful. Because, to say that Dr. Mattingly uses the word conventional or conventional understanding in several places in the book, but this is conventional from a Western perspective. From the Indian perspective, this is all perfectly normal. I mean, many Indians would recognize what goes on in China as pretty much what happens in India as well. So for example, the use of local civil society to enforce non-violent political repression and control. I mean, in India, we have the residents' welfare associations or WhatsApp groups that do precisely carry out precisely this function. What in China called lineage organizations are, could very well be or exactly castes in the Indian context. These are exploited by the CCP in China, and in India, any number of political actors exploit the caste and community affiliations to create trust and fellow feeling and to achieve their goals. I mean, the organization of village festivals, Dr. Mattingly's case study in Wuhan, I mean, this is familiar to all Indian sociologists, how religious festivals, temple festivals in India are co-opted for political control, political conversations. So, it is not unlikely that state power in China comes from society itself. In India and in China, in many third world countries, this is exactly the way state power is derived and amplified. The co-opting of local community leaders, lineage leaders, what we call in India caste panchayats or khap panchayats, all of these are co-opted by the state, and they are essential to the working of the state, the selection of candidates for political for elections in India, and so on. So none of these are actually surprising to the Indian reader. Strong societies, yes, complement a strong state, but it's the other part of Dr. Mattingly's argument that where strong civil society does not exist, that there is the ability for spontaneous protests, that I think needs a little more work. It's not quite convincing to me the case, because, and in fact, in this respect, the questions I have is, does civil society exist in minority communities in China, right? The same way they exist in what we call ecumenical China, right? For example, do elements of cultivation, co-optation, and infiltration work similarly in minority communities in China? Or is there much more obvious overt acts of political repression that work in those communities? So I think that's an important question if one is to look at China overall. The other is it's a statement that that while digital tools might reach maturity, the state will face age-old, and this I'm quoting Dr. Mattingly here, will face the age-old problems of how to act on vast amounts of data collected by society, by the bureaucracy. But this sort of flies against the skepticism of David Hume that Mattingly quotes, Dr. Mattingly quotes in his last chapter, that human beings are seldom persuaded to be interested for very long in their own long-term welfare, as opposed to immediate gratification. And similarly, it sort of flies, it is contrary to the success or the effectiveness of tech in quarreling of Muslim ethnic groups in Xinjiang or the Tibetans in the TAR, for example, or in other Tibetan areas. So when you say that in the long run, it's far from clear that these tactics of control, which is cultivation, co-optation, infiltration, as widespread as they are, will be sustainable. I wonder if that's not a value judgment as well, because I'm not quite sure that there is evidence presented that allows space for this doubt. If anything, you make a very good case that all of these work very well. So I'm not sure why suddenly you sort of conclude by doubting, in a sense, your own findings. In terms of questions for further research, and I know I'm running out of time here, it's an interesting statement that you make that voters rate, for example, at one point, that CCP members who are not also entrepreneurs, they trust people who are not entrepreneurs as well. I mean, people who are CCP members who are entrepreneurs are voted 10% lower than the others. But isn't this already evident to the CCP apparatchiks, themselves? And does not this drive Xi's push for ideological compliance, in a manner of speaking? Second, how politically transformative is China's religious revival? How does this impact the party's efforts at political control? Third, is the CCP an organism that thrives within the Chinese body politic, or is it one that seeks to be the body politic itself? I'm not sure if the difference is evident, but I think there is a difference, and I suspect that Xi's ambitions are driven by an understanding or a want or an ambition to be the latter. Finally, what is the impact of catastrophic events such as the Wenchuan earthquake or even the pandemic? I mean, you've talked about the Cultural Revolution, perhaps, but these are all slow-moving, shall we say, tragedies or disasters. How does political control react to catastrophic events? So in conclusion, I really enjoyed the book. The quotes in these book by Sun Yat-sen at the beginning and David Hume at the end are actually fantastic. And some of the quotes from the field work are actually quite evocative. I mean, there's one that says, "Woman pu swan iga chiatsu." I mean, we are not a family anymore. Or "Chuenzi yola yueshao." I mean, these are quotes. The circle gets smaller and smaller. These are quotes that could apply to any number of contexts in current political climate in China. And so, I mean, these are fantastic to sort of pull from your fieldwork as well. So in the end, I think this will be a book that will be interesting not just to students of China, but also to students of India. And my congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Jacob. Any kind of a discussion or a debate about political control today and with relation to China is not really complete without Hong Kong. We've seen how the National Security Act has been kind of used to consolidate, the CCP's hold over, a territory which is perceived as a recalcitrant or a kind of a troublesome territory. There have also been reports that, the CCP wants children to memorize the national security laws, and these are as young as school-going kindergarten children, and it wants teachers and professors to kind of report on any kind of violation. So if we could kind of come to this thing a bit later, but for now we have Antara. Antara has been a scholar who did a degree in China, and she studied in China, and she writes extensively on internal developments in China. So over to you, Antara.
Thank you, Kalpit, and many thanks to ORF for inviting me for this book discussion session. I agree with both Professor Dola and Professor Jacob that this is actually a wonderful book which provides answers to many pertinent questions like how authoritarian regime like China work, how does it control society, strengthen state capacity, how does it implement ambitious policies that intervenes in people's personal life and still ensure compliance from people while avoiding any major backlash. To me, the most interesting part of the book is how it challenges the many existing notions or conventional wisdom about China in specific and other authoritative regimes in general. For example, contrary to our general understanding that a strong civil society strengthens citizens' control over government, the book shows how civil society groups in China actually gives the state a leverage over its citizen and strengthen the state's coercive capacity. The book demonstrates how these groups actually help officials in rural China to maintain order, collect taxes, and implement policies, and thereby serve as the state's hidden tool for informal control of the society. The book also argues that it is in these communities in China where such civil society groups are comparatively absent, which finds it easiest to act collectively and resist the state. So in the Chinese setup, it is the disconnected, disorganized groups, leaderless protests that tend to be more successful at organizing and challenging the state. So yeah. And the second narrative that the book challenges is that China under Xi Jinping is going through heightened political repression, where mass surveillance and artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and all has become the state's preferred tools to monitor or control its citizen. In the contrary, the book argues that except for problematic cases like Xinjiang and others, China still mostly relies on human and not digital tactics for authoritarian repression and control. Cultivating a regime-friendly civil society, co-opting local elites, and creating infiltrating institutions are shown as the most important tools in China's state arsenals to exert informal control over the society. Apart from these arguments, I think the other most important aspect of the book is its research design part. There is an impressive mix of both qualitative and quantitative research methods, which I'm sure will intrigue many readers. On one hand, there are structured case studies, evidences, paired examples from various villages across China. On the other hand, there are exhaustive quantitative field research and micro-level surveys to complement these qualitative case studies. Secondly, it is the comparative approach of this study that makes it really very interesting. Comparison between social political institutions in different Chinese villages, comparison between China and other authoritative and non-authoritative states, including India. Comparison between today's China and imperial Chinese state, which use similar control systems like Baotia, Liqia, etc. I think all these comparisons make the, it adds on to the richness of this study. I do have some questions for you, Professor. First is how easy or difficult was it for you to conduct this kind of research in China, which I'm sure will be considered a sensitive topic in the Chinese setup, particularly reaching out to the grassroots level, interacting with the dissidents, protesters, studying the complicated lineage and clan system. and doing all that without inviting Chinese, the government's prying eyes or curiosity. How possible is that, and what exactly was your experience on this? And secondly, the book analyzes the Chinese state's coercive capacity through the lens of what you call the regime's top 3 policy priorities in rural area, that is land requisition and one-child policy, and limiting and controlling protests. So I just wanted to understand what about situation like a serious public health crisis in the lines of COVID, in the lines of the COVID crisis. What role does these organizations play or can play when the state is somewhat in the back foot, or have to take unpopular measures and ensure strict compliance to those measures? And thirdly, my question is, you make a mention about CCP's United Front Work Department and its love-hate relationship with these grassroots groups, where there is a lot of suspicion on one hand on these groups. At the same time, there is an acknowledgement of their usefulness. So you seem to suggest that these institutions are not a given ally of the state and can prove to be detrimental to the state's interest if they are not handled properly. So how does the Chinese state maintain this delicate balance in its relationship with these social institutions? So yes, I'll be grateful, Professor, if you may kindly throw light on these issues. And yes, thank you very much, and compliments on your new wonderful book. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Antara. Thank you. And I thank all the 3 discussants for their comments and observations. Now over to you, Dr. Mattingly, for your response.
Great, thank you so much. First, thank you to all 3 of you for taking the time to engage with the book. It means a lot. Also to that 3 scholars whose work I really admire. The generosity of your comments is really appreciated. And of course, all of you also, I think, pointed out some of the weaknesses and asked some provocative questions to think for me to think about with this book. So let me, since I think we only have about 5 minutes left, I'll try to be quick. I won't be able to answer and respond to all of the really amazing, excellent questions that all of you raised, but I'll try to address one overarching issue, and then I'll kind of try to respond to one thing that each of you said. But of course, all the other stuff is very well taken and stuff that I'll continue to think about, especially as I'm working on the next book project. So the overarching thing I wanted to talk about is one of the theoretical lessons of the book is this idea that civil society, which in a Western sense is often argued to be a force for political accountability that can be used to increase social capital, connect people to each other, and therefore hold governments accountable. I'm arguing here is in fact a good deal more authoritarian. And a number of you, especially Professor Dole and Jacob, pointed out that it could have been useful in the book to have more discussion of what civil society is and do a better job defending my definition, and just a more expansive discussion that engages with more authors. And I completely agree. I'll defend myself here a little bit first, and then point out some directions for future research. So in my own defense, I do think that certainly for other Western scholars, and I think that the limits of that is very rightly pointed out by both of your comments. There is this kind of still obsession with this idea that civil society is a force for accountability, and I'm responding, especially to the work of people like Robert Putnam and my colleague Lily Tsai, who works on China and argues that some of the very same groups that I study are forces for political accountability, and I think that Tsai is right. It's maybe the most influential book in American political science about China, at least among Americans, is Lily Tsai's book, Accountability Without Democracy, that talks about how these groups are forces for accountability. And my work is partly inspired by her work, and having spent a little bit of time in rural China, thinking, well, these groups also really have another side that she doesn't really develop in her book. And so that's my sort of entree into thinking theoretically about what these groups do. I also think so. One is I think positioning myself to argue against these authors, and two, if I was going to critique the sort of Habermasian idea about civil society and this idea that civil society is autonomous from the state, I think that once you define civil society in this way, it becomes, to me, less interesting. If you define civil society as being independent from the state, if you define civil society in a way that sort of presupposes that it's really going to be a force that will challenge the state, I think as a social scientist, it takes away some of the interesting questions about what civil society really is and what it does. But having said those two things in defense of myself, I think the critique is absolutely right. That, first of all, I should have discussed it more in the book. So an avenue for future research for myself and for others. And two, I do think that there are limits to the way that I discussed the very broad, expansive definition that I give of civil society. It's not going to satisfy everyone, and I completely see the limits that Professors Dohle and Jacob pointed out. So let me now just briefly take a question from each, and with 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure there are a couple of great questions from the audience. So first, Professor Dohle, among many other great comments, suggested thinking more about this rural-urban dichotomy, and I think this is exactly a great avenue for future research. I have a colleague at Stanford, Jennifer Pan, who just wrote a book, Welfare for Autocrats, that talks a little bit about this in urban settings. Ben Reed at UC Santa Cruz talks a little bit about this, how this process works in urban settings. As a dissertation, as one book and one, started as a dissertation project, focusing on rural China was kind of enough. It would have been a lot to do urban China, but I do think this is a great avenue for future research, because I do think, and some of my own kind of more exploratory research suggests that the same dynamics are at work in urban China. But I think that Professor Dohle, the instinct here is right, that there are probably also differences that would be interesting to theorize that I don't in this book. So I think that's a great avenue for future research. Professor Jacob brought up a number of interesting points. One, this question about how this process works among minority groups. And I do think that these same tools are at use, but the mix of tools that are used, if you're talking here about ethnic minorities, for example, or religious minorities, the tools that are used are the mix, the emphasis that the state places on, say, infiltration, using parastate groups to infiltrate these groups versus cultivation, I think it differs across time and also across different groups. So I think now you see a lot of emphasis on the strategy of infiltration, for example, in the province of Xinjiang, rather than co-optation. The state was using co-optation more in Xinjiang, maybe in prior decades. Finally, and this actually links up to something Professor Antara said about this question about catastrophic events. I do think, again, that this balance changes across in these kind of extraordinary moments. Professor Antara asked, how easy was it to conduct research? I know I only have 2 minutes left here, so it was this is a book that I started at the very end of the Huijin Tower, the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, and continued to do field research. And it got more difficult over time. So I think this is important if there are any kind of students or people just starting out in the audience to think about the kinds of research that are field research that's practical now. I think it's changed. It changed a lot over the course of writing this book. It's an important question. I'm actually hosting in a couple weeks an event to talk about field research in China. So if you're interested, if you're a student, you're interested in attending, it's going to be a set of panels. Shoot me an email, daniel.mattingly@yale.edu, and we can get you on the list for the Zoom invite for this. So this is a very important question, especially for people who aren't as far along, who are earlier in the careers, to think about this, and this kind of trying to understand this is really, really important. So I'm out of time. I spoke for longer than I meant to. Kalpit, do I have time to field any of these questions from the audience, or do we have a hard stop right now?
We can take. I think we can take one question.
Okay. So the first question that came up was talking about the fact that it's communities that lack strong civil society groups that find it easiest to act collectively and spontaneously resist the state. It's actually something that Professor Jacob brought up in his comments, and I think. So this, this is something that I did see in rural China. So like the absence of these groups in some cases, especially of groups that whose leaders have been co-opted, in some cases did make it easier for people to organize spontaneously against the state and resist land requisitions. If they had kind of quasi-independent, say, lineage associations, or even just villages that entirely lacked these associations, and these associations hadn't been co-opted, it became easier for them for groups to organize against the state to do things like resist land requisitions without it being a kind of tool for monitoring and control by the state. I'll just briefly point out, and I said I've gone over, that I think this is something you did see in the Hong Kong protests in 2019. Something I wrote briefly about in a blog post for the Washington Post. That this is kind of leaderless protest is, I think, a model for protests that's I saw in rural China, but is kind of spreading around the world as these tools for monitoring control, both the informal kind of social tools and like electronic eavesdropping, surveillance, and censorship become more effective. Leaderless protests are something that you see everywhere from Hong Kong to the independence protests in Spain. So I want to thank everybody again for this really fantastic, engaging discussion. You've given me a lot of food for thought, the three discussants and the audience, and so I really, really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody at ORF as well.
Yeah, this has been a very stimulating discussion, and we look forward at ORF. We look forward to having many more such discussions. Thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for logging in, and especially the discussants. I mean, they've taken time out to kind of log in through this. And finally, one request to the audience is do read Professor Mattingly's book. It's about it's around 180 pages, but there are a lot of it's extremely informative. It has a lot of diagrams and tables, and this is something which will be of great interest to scholars of China who are interested in authoritarian regimes and political control, themes of repression, and civil society. That's all we have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this, and do keep tuning on to the ORF platform, and we will have many more such stimulating debates. Thank you again. Thank you so much.